I remember seeing this 1959 image of Aurora Vargas being evicted from her home in Chavez Ravine. The government had promised public housing for this neighborhood, but Vargas refused to be moved from her home. Ultimately, the public housing land was sold to the Dodgers for their new stadium. I live about a 15-minute walk away from where Vargas's photos were taken, and over 40 years later, displacement has never felt so familiar. First, it was Starbucks, then American Apparel that came. Before I knew it, a bunch of overpriced hipster shops and boutiques took over Sunset. I grew up in historic Filipino town, titled The Poor Man's Echo Park by LA Weekly. Echo Park was the closest green space we had when I was growing up. So every week, my mom would take us to Echo Park Lake to go feed the ducks. After the $45 million renovation, I started to feel like an intruder in my own park. The rents of all long-term residents rose, and after 2 years of living in Westwood, I moved back home to help my family pay rent for a one-bedroom at $1,600, double what we were paying for when I was growing up. This film was inspired by both the anger and love I have for my changing neighborhood and the ongoing resistance on behalf of the residents.
My name is Dalia Palacios. I grew up in Echo Park. I was displaced it's going to be 4 years actually this year. I still consider Echo Park to still be my home, like it's changed since I've left, but I consider that to be my home. I heard my parents discussing like they were stressing about how are they going to meet rent money. They started paying off $900. Then out of nowhere, it started being like $1,000, $1,100, $1,200, and like I said at that time, I was only working part time, but as like a student in high school. So even though I really wanted to help out my parents, I really couldn't. There wasn't really I didn't have that much experience, or and it was hard. It was hard because I started seeing all these changes, but I wasn't able to really realize what was going on until after the fact that my neighbors were moving out and the place was empty. I wasn't really when folks were moving into I didn't really it wasn't really gentrification that came to mind. It took some time to build that up, and then when I started seeing what these folks were doing and the way that it was making our rent go higher, that's when I was like, oh damn, shit, who knew that having these people moving in would affect my living conditions and my family's living conditions.
Oh, that's cool, dude.
I did it black and white. But see how it's
Yeah.
it didn't render?
You know that dude, the show killer?
My name is I1.
I made it.
I moved to LA when I was 6, and I moved to the Echo Park area. I lived there through junior high, and then from there I moved to Atwater. So I guess it's kind of, back then it didn't seem like it was that close, but it's still in the same general part of LA. I studied graphic design at UCLA, and I've been painting graffiti since the beginning of high school. These characters came about as part of their Otra Campaña initiative. So they initially started out as just just digital character designs. Once a friend of mine that's also based in the Echo Park, Silver Lake area, Cache, saw those characters, he asked me to paint them on some of the walls that he has in that area. that's how I started painting them actually on the streets. Basically a big wall that was really run down. It was really like bombed on, and so we just decided to paint it there as a, as a prime location to have those characters up. I think just the taking of spaces in those neighborhoods that are not spaces sanctioned for artwork and murals, I think is a direct extension of what the Zapatistas do, where they take their land back for their uses, for their needs. So we're in our own little way, we're taking back spaces to express something creatively. But on the flip side, it's almost like gentrification allows that to happen on those walls. So since the neighborhoods are changing, they tend to be more open to the type of graffiti that we've been putting on them. So it's I think it cuts both ways, and it's hard as being someone who paints that stuff. It's hard to like determine which way the work gets taken. I think I've come to accept that our work has flourished because of gentrification. It's been accepted because it makes those communities feel more artistic, which for some reason always seems to be a tenet of when an area starts getting to become gentrified.
I can probably go green.
My name is Sandra de la Losa, and I grew up in El Sereno. My family has lived in Los Angeles since my parents were born here in the late 1920s. So pretty much I'm second generation, and my family's lived within like a 6-mile radius for like almost 90 years. I think we need to be more informed about the processes of gentrification, because artists can be used to make a neighborhood more desirable, So I think it's important to be aware of that, so we don't play into those processes of gentrification. Our art doesn't get used by developers, by those who want to create an image of a hip, attractive cultural hub and center. So Echoes in the Echoes was the second series in a series of guerrilla plaques I inserted in a public space. When I became aware that Echo Park was radically changing, and I was witnessing many gay Latino bars being displaced. When I hung out in Echo Park, Silver Lake in the 1990s, it was like interesting intersection of a lot of different subcultures, ethnic identities kind of coming together and kind of clashing. Until the early 2000s, where I maybe became more cognizant, or the visibility of a more obvious physical pushing out of working class Latino families kind of happened. And then in terms of storefronts, it was for me really becoming visible in terms of bars, as like hip bars started popping up around Echo Park. Both Echo Park and Silver Lake had a long history of gay culture, so there are many different subcultures within. So there were a number, especially more so probably in Echo Park than Silver Lake, a number of primarily gay Latino bars that were present. And I became very aware, and as someone who frequented some of them, not all of them, I became aware, one, of how important those spaces were, and how rare those kind of spaces were, and how they were kind of became a second home to certain populations, and that those spaces were being lost. So definitely I was left. What happens to these communities and cultures that were created in these bars? And so I wanted to commemorate those spaces through the plaques.
This was once home to Club Fire, Born 1999 to 4 queer indigenous filmmakers known as The Collective, women image makers. It was their vision to create a space for others like them, music lovers, cumbia, reggae, salsa, hip-hop, house lovers, film and art lovers, lovers of social justice and freedom, lovers of women of color to come together and celebrate all that makes the queer women of color community so amazing and unique.
Well, gentrification, I think, is the nice way to say it, because I think even a lot of developers and city agencies are already using gentrification as like, hey, this neighborhood's getting gentrified. Like, I've heard real estate people out of their mouth say, this place is getting gentrified, so it's a good buy, right? And so I'm in the act of resisting displacement, is what I say. And definitely one of those acts for me is just continuously living here and having my dad kind of hold this space for a while. My name is Rio Contreras. I grew up here in Echo Park. I'm actually, right now we're sitting in the house I grew up in. My parents have owned this house since like 85, 86. We're one of the last remaining houses on this block that has not been gentrified or been displaced. And the reason for that is because Echo Park Lake is literally just a house over. So it's obviously a very hot spot, and millions of people have come and offered money to my dad to get the house. So this is how a city agency colludes with the developer. Never before had the city bothered my dad about the house. And one day, the fire inspection came, they inspected it. You know, you have to do all these upgrades. Again, you have to do all these upgrades. Fortunately, what's fortunate about my dad is that he is in the business of real estate, so he knows the rules and laws. So he said, no, actually, here's my paperwork that shows why I am actually within code. And he pulled out his paperwork. But even within that span, with him finding it, somebody came again and offered cash for the house. Because you get scared, you get intimidated. You're like, fuck, am I violating a code? Shit, it's gonna cost me this much money. But he had all the tools and knowledge and resources to actually be able to fend that. And that is the reason why this is still brown owned, because that building next to us is not. This one's just up for sale. That one's up for sale. That one's white owned. That one's white owned. That one I think might still be brown owned. Like, there is so much white owned stuff. Like, it was all brown owned when I grew up. Because this was awesome. Like, brown people could actually own a home. It's physical, right? It's like people literally being moved out. But it's also really psychological in the fact that it really actually tears apart children's and young people's minds. Because when I was growing up here, when I was 16, that's when gentrification just got started. And I remember seeing where the building that is now the Echo Park Film Center was the first thing that really started shifting around here. And for me at that time, I associated, well, whiteness brings in clean and pretty art, and brown people are violent. And that is not okay for a young brown child to grow up with that kind of mentality that we as brown people are bad for our environment, because basically that's reflecting that that's what I think about myself. To white allies or even folks of color who've recently moved into the community, for the brown people they call it gentrification or whatever the hell, is the absolutely support these efforts. And I think one of the things that we did as state was we had a big giant circle of 60 people, and we said we're gonna split up into 2 circles. One circle is gonna be of long-term residents, and the other circle will be of people who are in solidarity with our efforts. This was an important split. The people in solidarity with our efforts felt uncomfortable, but it was not to isolate them. It was to highlight and center the voices of the long-term residents. And the minute we did that, all the homies who were standing on the back, which included some of the youth, who didn't want to step up into the circle, came into the circle, and that's when they started speaking. So this is really important, that if allies want to be in solidarity with us, if anybody wants to be in true solidarity with us, the voices of the most marginalized are centered first and foremost. You don't need to offer your opinion, you need to offer your services.
So what about the hipsters, the unapologetic gentrifiers and pioneers of the new world?
And where are you originally from?
I'm originally from the New York area.
Okay.
Yeah, in a certain sense. This is like the first neighborhood I feel like I really knew and understood in LA. It's to everything, yet has its own very defined sense of place. It feels like uniquely Echo Park. I know when I'm here that I'm not really anywhere else.
Echo Park, a Latino community built over 50 years, still remains predominantly Latino.
Sube porque hay más güeros, ha metido más güeros.